Welcome once again to the Gaming News Canada show presented by Bede Gaming. I'm your host, Steve McAllister. The annual rendezvous of the Canadian gaming industry at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre will have a new name and a new date this year. That's right, the Canadian Gaming Summit is no longer. Its new name is SBC Summit Canada, and it will take place May 19th to 21st. The Canadian Conference is one of 5 owned and operated by SBC, which is busy getting ready for next month's SBC Summit Rio in Brazil, and at the same time preparing for its other events in Malta, Fort Lauderdale, and its flagship event in Lisbon this fall. To talk more about the year ahead, including the plans for SBC Summit Canada, we welcome back to the Gaming News Canada show the Senior Marketing Director for SBC, Dennis Algreen. Dennis, you're joining us from London. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks for having me, man.
Hey, Dennis, in the introduction, I'm feeling like I forgot. I mentioned 4 of the shows, and I think I forgot the 5th. Is that right?
I think the one you forgot is the first upcoming one, which is our Rio-based event coming up on 3rd to 5th of March in Rio.
Excellent. I want to start with I think the news came out last year at the summit in Toronto that there was going to be a rebrand of the summit, and again, I don't think it makes perfect sense. It's aligned with your other conferences. I guess maybe the more relevant point is changing the date for it, and I'm thinking there's probably a couple of reasons for switching the conference from June to a May date.
Yeah, I mean, look, aside from us consistently having to always try our best to navigate a congested events calendar, if you look at the global industry, there are considerations there to have. We also are aware, there's a World Cup element this year to kind of navigate around as well, and we want to consistently be kind of receptive and sensitive to priorities from our clients and our stakeholders. Ultimately, we're here to serve the industry, so we try our best to find solutions that are optimal for most people in the industry.
Hey, Dennis, we were talking off camera just about the craziness that you and your staff are going through right now, Bob McFarlane and the rest of the gang. And again, as someone who would have trouble organizing a 1-car parade, I mean, I just can't imagine how daunting a task this is. But what is the process right now? Like in terms of getting ready for Rio, are you having meetings every day? And then also, how do you kind of keep your eye on the ball with regards to the conferences down the road?
Yeah, I think that is exactly the biggest challenge we always would have is essentially we're juggling quite a few balls in the air at the same time, right? And we want to make sure that each of these events and thus each of these products, if you will, are granted the necessary attention to detail and attention in general. But oftentimes the internal stakeholders on our end are the same. I mean, I'm a relatively decent example of that because I have to oversee the campaigns and the marketing positioning and such across the events portfolio. So while most of that is prep done well in advance, however, and when we close in on an event like the Rio one coming up, we get into this kind of what I refer to as kind of crunch time mode. This is when a lot of registrations are coming in. The sponsorship and exhibitor deals are kind of finalized, and they need to be in place well in time because there's production that needs to happen in relation to those. So it's really a logistical kind of puzzle piece that consistently needs to be juggled with, and then that would be my analogy, with at the same time as you're doing 4 other puzzles, right? So, and then it comes down to scale and kind of managing that carefully on our end. But it makes for a challenging and fun, definitely never boring environment, because you've always got the next ball in the air before you've kind of dropped one. So that's kind of the life of event organizers, especially when you have this many kind of global event brands to juggle. That's really important that we really keep our focus straight. So that, for instance, an event like the SBC Summit Canada really gets still the development and the attention that it deserves and the market deserves, right?
You must find too, though, that I'm sure for you and your staff, there's a bit of excitement, and one of the I think the perks of the job is having a chance to spend time in Rio, spend time in Malta, of course, Lisbon in the fall, and Toronto, and I would think that being in those different destinations is, helps with that craziness and helps deal with all the nuttiness that goes on around the conferences.
Yeah, the way I see it is when we go on site, it makes for, first of all, it makes for a nice kind of just not a break in terms of quiet time, but a break in terms of something different than what you have to deal with every day. You go into this on-site mode where it's about execution. It's about making sure that all of the attendees, sponsors, exhibitors, speakers, everybody has as fluent an experience as possible, right? And I think we're quite well known for, and a hallmark of how we do things is that we go above and beyond for that experience. We're not this and will never be this faceless corporation. Our staff are out there, my marketing team are there, because not only for that dispersion in your work life, but also because the amount of stuff that we learn and the understanding you can develop by actually being there with the attendees, having those conversations with them, that's actually really core for how we can keep developing our product, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think given my experience with the SBC summits in both New Jersey and Toronto, I mean, you literally can't walk 50 feet on the exhibit floor without running into you or Bob or one of the SBC SBP people. That's true. And again, just they are so well run. Just little things like food, and I know some people might roll their eyes when you mention food, but the fact that you don't have to leave the Metro Toronto Convention Center for those 2.5 days of the conference because you can get a decent breakfast in the morning or get a decent lunch. It is those little things that make the conference so enjoyable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, as I said, that level of attention to detail, and sometimes that detail can be in how we structure and develop the conference content for maximum learning, but they can also be really practical, nitty-gritty stuff like, how do I enter or exit the venue? How convenient is everything made for me so that when you go, you can focus on what you are there for, because you're not there to get food. You're not there those are just things that need to be solved, right? So it's really important that we create an environment where our stakeholders can essentially help optimize, and they are put in a position where they can optimize their value position and perception. And you asked earlier about the rebrand. I think this is where I think what people can expect from that is really just that it is a natural progression and continuation of what we've already done with the show. We took over a show and we've really put a lot of effort into applying our way of thinking to it. And I think, from all the feedback we've had over the last few years, that has been very much appreciated. We built something that it has a top-notch modern feel to it, and a sense of quality that is kind of top-notch. Yeah, the market deserves this, and Canada, if you compare it to, some markets, is not terribly big, but it's still big enough that it merits thousands coming together like this each year, right? So.
Yeah, and I think it's also a market that's a lot more mature than some people might realize. Even though we're only entering the 4-year anniversary of the Open Ontario market. Gambling's been around here for a long time. There's a lot of big gaming companies. Bragg comes to mind off the top of my head. Geo Comply, and I know I'm missing a bunch here, so I'll apologize for that. But this is a very mature, rich gambling industry that's been here for an awful long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, similar to what we saw, well, I would maybe not even directly draw parallels to the US, but to some degree, similar to what we saw there, it's the online element, of course, kind of threw a lot of stuff up in the air, and that required a lot of new conversations, a lot of new connections. Everybody's positioning in the market, everybody's position towards the market shifts when something like that happens. And that will potentially then continue to happen a little bit, or at least in increments, as new kind of markets or territories open up, right? That could be the likely consequence.
Hey, Dennis, in terms of the entire conference industry, and again, there's a lot of conferences in this business, and I remember things like when I started covering the industry, we Gaming News Canada celebrated its 5th anniversary last week, and I remember going to conferences early, and the people talking to me about the days of the scantily clad showgirls on the conference floor and the change with that. And I think even in the short time I've been involved, you go to an SBC Summit Canada now, and I would say it's like 50% of the room is female now, and I don't think that was the case in the past. But other than that, like what do you see have been the biggest changes with the conferences, whether it's content or the experience? Or I think you're right, obviously the explosion of online gaming, that I'm sure that's had a dramatic impact on the look and feel of conferences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think technically maybe the Canadian event is a little bit of a slight offshoot in terms of some of the development that's happened kind of globally with events, right? Because you referred a little bit to it. The way I would look at it is that I think the industry as a whole has developed into a much more, let's call it, modern and professionalized industry. And that goes all the way from how these conferences and exhibitions are conducted. It goes to what the businesses are like that are acting in this industry, right? Because the industry has been able to go from what I viewed as kind of, slight pirate style, if you go back 20 years, because there's so many places that are now regulated, and this is a valid, legal and regulated industry in Canada. And I think it's just that what's happened is that we are also as an industry, and that reflects on the events, conducting ourselves as such, right? So I joined the industry 9.5 years ago, and you're right, it was a slightly different environment even then. And this has been part of something that we've always tried to at least do ours to push towards, which is this professionalism and professionalization. I remember having a conversation with one of my industry friends in Malta, who also mentioned, for instance, that the shift there as a kind of a hub for industry workers has also become the same, right? It used to be, well, anybody could essentially more or less maybe get a job or get their foot in the door in the industry. Now the requirements or the floor for that are much higher, because we have such a, we've really upped our game and the professionalism across the board, and that sets the tone for the whole thing, right? We've always been spearheaded and kind of speakers for regulated markets, for a very trustworthy and very content driven, like fact driven way of producing our shows that then has that level of attention to detail where every single stakeholder we try to think into this, because you may not be after the same ROI or the same value as, say, an affiliate that attends the show, right? They might come in with a very, very strict and very straightforward objective, which is, I need to catch up with as many operators as possible and get my deals either improved, secured, or confirmed. That's it, right? It's pretty kind of very, very focused objective. And then you've got, big operator corporations who are there to not only engage with the industry, but they want to engage with regulators. They want to engage with suppliers. They need to understand, more about the markets. And then when there are market shifts, whether that is regulatory shifts in an existing market, or it's the emergence of something like Alberta, where, oh, wait a second, there's a potential new market here, that kind of shapes what they're after.
Yeah, I think you make a great point about the professionalism, Dennis. And you look at, people are coming into this regulated industry, and we've seen this in Canada, certainly from, the banking industry. You have some of the most prominent law firms across Canada who work, do a lot of work in this industry. You look at the people working on the supplier side, and I'm always reminded of Kelly Brooks, the former owner of Quarter Four, when Kelly and Daniela Kovic first started that company 5 years ago, and having a hard time getting like a handful of resumes for an engineering job. And like a year later, having access to some of the top engineering student graduates in the country. And, even in terms of the people that cover this industry, you have a lot of journalists covering this industry who have impressive resumes. These aren't people that have, taken a 4-month journalism program online. I mean, these are people who have had, in the case of Jeff Zacconi from Covers, who covered Queen's Park, the Ontario government, and then moved into the gaming industry. So there's a lot of sophistication around this industry. And that's kind of a good segue to, sometimes when I have guests on the podcast, when we get towards the end of a calendar year, there's a bit of conference fatigue. And when I talk to them off camera, they're kind of fed up with the trains, planes, and automobiles and hotel rooms from attending the various conferences. But when you look at SBC's portfolio, it's a pretty exciting time where every market you're going into has kind of a unique set of circumstances, or there's unique topics that are going on. I mean, obviously, even though we've been talking about Alberta, I think for the last 3 SBC Summit Canadas, it's going to be almost in real time this year. I think there's an expectation the market's going to open this year. It might even be very close to when you have the conference here in May. And you talk about Rio, and you look at what's going on. I think Brazil's like a year into their legal online sports betting industry now, and the success that they've had there. And when you do your Americans event in Fort Lauderdale, we can't put out a newsletter these days without mentioning prediction markets, and that's and that's an industry in the U.S. right now that's going through a lot of change and a lot of controversy and a lot of storylines. So I think in terms of the content and those panels that SBC is going to run, every market is going to be unique in the kind of programming you provide.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the way we tend to look at it is that we've got a formula for how to deliver a quality event, right? But then each event has its own intricacies, either because of the markets that it pertains to or deals with, or in the nature of what the event offers, right? So while we refer to our events now as SBC Summits, and for the most part, or pretty much entirely, they are a mix of world class, and I would say the top of the industry conference content and learning, but then they have varying degrees of expo floor and expo element to them, where it's more commercially, more kind of deal driven, if you will. But aside from that, the conference content is one of the biggest diversifiers between these, and that has to be in tune with the actual market that this event is for, right? So it really helps shape up, and from my perspective, because I'm coming at things from a marketing point of view, it really helps shape up the direction and the positioning of the individual event. What is it that makes this event unique, and what does it offer the audience? We have such a strong conference production team, and at the same time, we're lucky enough that we also have the media arm, which helps us essentially with just base knowledge to customize these things. And I think one of the things we take care of, and then is what will be reflected in the agenda for SBC Summit Canada this year, is we really sharpened the focus rather than just adding more content, right? So we're structuring the agenda around very clear outcome-driven tracks. However they're named, sports betting and iGaming or affiliates and advertising, they are, we've elevated some of those elements and added these specialist forums like player protection symposium, and now also a cybersecurity symposium. So we're trying to reflect where real investment and kind of regulatory attention is going. So the aim is essentially just kind of less noise, more relevance, and conversations that people can kind of take with them back to their businesses and apply, right?
Is your iGaming platform ready for Alberta? Bede Gaming is ready to support your new market entry with a SOC 2 compliant platform, multi-tenant infrastructure model, and unlimited configurability. Future-proof your iGaming performance today with a solid foundation for your next province. Bede Gaming is your partner for success. Get in touch at bedegaming.com. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here, Dennis, but we do have reporters from mainstream media outlets who subscribe to the newsletter and the podcast. And every year I kind of make the case that if you're someone who's covering the gambling industry, but you can't do it on a regular basis, like, it's so beneficial to come to the conference and at the very least take a day and identify 3 or 4 panels to come and attend, because there's access to great information, but there's also access to the people. And in a world where we tend to use a lot of email anymore, and we don't have a lot of FaceTime with people, just having the opportunity to introduce yourself to a Paul Burns from the Canadian Gaming Association, or a Derek Ram from Connectify, or the people that are in charge of the operators in Ontario, or the elected officials. That's access that's so easy to have on the floor at the Metro Toronto Convention Center.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big advantages that a show like SBC Summit Canada will always have is, while sure, if you go to one of the big global expos like SBC Summit in Lisbon, there's very, very tangible, scalable commercial value in that. However, there you might struggle to have a conversation with the people that you actually want to talk to or would benefit you the most. And there's an intimacy to something like the SBC Summit Canada that's going to be hard to kind of apply to the bigger shows, if you will. That's where the regional element comes in, right? So if your main interest is the Canadian industry, then you will find absolutely everybody that you can imagine you will want to have conversations with in one place over 2 days. That is just convenient, right? Straight up.
Hey, Dennis, the news out of Alberta back in January, has it had an impact on your summit in Canada?
Yeah, of course it has. I mean, as you said, while it's been reflected upon for a long time. I mean, right now it is one of the most talked about topics in Canada, and so naturally it also shapes the agenda. We're seeing huge interest from both operators, suppliers, affiliates, and advisors trying to understand what Alberta's model might look like, how it will compare to, say, Ontario, and kind of what the right size regulation really means for it, because it impacts everybody in terms of how they can engage with this. So I think SBC Summit Canada becomes a neutral ground for regulators, incumbents, and kind of new entrants to discuss those implications openly. Also, before those decisions might be logged in, and even when they are logged in, we still need to then now understand them, because oftentimes their understanding and comprehension of a regulatory framework can't really begin until it's in place, right?
I just wonder, going back for a second to that, the conference circuit is so highly competitive these days. Like, what are the challenges for SBC now? Because again, it's a fairly significant investment for an operator, a supplier, a payment company to not only attend these shows, but also to have an exhibit or whatever, have floor space. So, what are the challenges for SBC in that environment?
I mean, look, the obvious challenge is that there are probably across the board from an industry perspective and globally, there are more events than ever, right? So the main challenge then becomes, how do we make sure that each of our events has a tangible value offering that you won't necessarily find anywhere else, right? And we are lucky enough that we are dynamic enough and have the background and the foundation to kind of do the type of show that an individual location or market really needs, right? So as one of the few organizers, I would claim we have the ability to put on a massive global trade show a la SBC Summit in Lisbon, but we also at the same time have the expertise and the experience to put on a more focused show that's driven more by a kind of jurisdiction specific, regulator inclusive conversations. And I think, especially in Canada, I think stakeholders really value like depth, credibility, and balance in that. And the way that we can then kind of diversify or specify each of the events in our portfolio is exactly that. Because while there are values to be had at each of these, but if you're serious about the SBC, like the Canadian market, right, then this is the event you absolutely need to be at. Then there could be commercial opportunities at some of our bigger events that are probably likely to you want to throw in the mix as well. But where else are you going to find everybody that you would want to kind of engage with in one place, right?
Yeah, and I would suggest that we've really seen that the past 2 years in particular. The provincial lottery and gaming corporations have had a big presence at the last two summits. And I think last year SBC introduced there was a First Nations element that I don't think I'd seen before in Toronto. But again, I think there is that opportunity, Dennis, for regardless of where you work in the Canadian gaming industry, if you're a provincial lottery and gaming corporation, you should be there. If you're part of the regulated industry in Ontario and with Alberta to follow, you probably should be there. And I wonder, because I know how much the SBC Summit Americas focuses on what are the indigenous communities, what you refer to as tribes in the U.S., that there might be more of an opportunity down the road with First Nations casinos and First Nations gaming businesses, especially given that the First Nations has a very has a very heavy say in the regulated market in Alberta.
Absolutely. I think, look, from our point of view, we are better as an industry if all voices are heard, right? So from our point of view, it's really, really important that there is ample representation of the different stakeholders, the different sides and angles and approaches that we all have to the industry, and those can differ. Like our objectives will differ immensely between, a First Nation and a provincial lottery. Of course they will, but when are we ever going to improve and develop how we work with the industry and how we engage with each other if we don't engage with each other, right? That's the whole point, actually, is we're here, and our kind of goal is to serve the industry. And I truly believe that the industry is always best served by having topical, serious, and a kind of focused conversations about the whatever it is that matters to us in that period. And that can then shift, of course, and then that will shift over time as the markets develop and kind of new things emerge. That's only natural, right? But I think that is absolutely key, is through collaboration, through conversation, and through engagement, we all kind of create a richer environment for all of us.
And I think, having that broad dialogue, and again, we might not always agree with everything. And I think, we're seeing this as a problem with the current state of the world from a political standpoint. It's always good to listen to a different voice, or a voice that you might not agree with. And there are always lessons learned from those conversations. And so, and I think that applies to what you're doing with the conferences.
Absolutely. I think even from a personal point of view, I think it is, I oftentimes learn more by listening to an opinion that isn't shared by myself, right? I think that's really, really vital. Otherwise, there's something called confirmation bias, right? Otherwise, we just sit here and we can just agree that we all agree on everything. It doesn't move anything. It doesn't really create development. So I think, it's really important that we, as an industry and as individuals, we're willing to challenge ourselves and actually listen to sometimes an opposing opinion. We also sometimes kid around about this, because even from just a single panel setup point of view, oftentimes we see that the value from a panel can be vastly increased if opposing perspectives are represented, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a balancing act for you and Bob and the rest of the group at SBC, is that, I understand there are sponsor obligations now with regards to the panels, but you're right. When there's a little bit of tension between panelists, it makes for a better discussion and more lessons learned. And I know, and I've been lucky to moderate panels at both the SBC Summit Americas and the SBC Summit Canada. It is nice when you do get diverse voices and there is a little bit of push and pull between the people on the stage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, look, we spend so much time trying to not only develop what the topics need to be, but also find the right people to talk about them, right? And I can't even talk about that because this is not my hassle. That's the conference producers that have that particular pain. But I know that we are talking painstakingly planning this out from the get-go. Okay, and then you start with a short list, a wish list, if you will. This was ideal scenarios. You probably have to have contingencies and alternatives ready on hand, because some people may not be able to make it, or they're not willing to speak, or there could be other reasons, right? But we try to tailor that from our side, and I say we, knowing full well that's not my work. I shouldn't take credit for that. But conference producers do such a stellar job of really making the content both interesting and useful at the same time. Because let's face it, there is an element of engagement or entertainment value, even, if you will, in also creating something that people actually find, something they want to experience.
Hey, Dennis, last question. Just given your connection now with the event in Toronto, like, is there something unique from the Canadian Summit, that's apart from the other conference that SBC runs? Or I just wonder, is there a conversation you've had with somebody over the past 2 or 3 years in Toronto, or again, just something that differentiates the Toronto stop from your other conferences?
Well, I think one of the things is this idea that it's a market that has a scale where it is actually even feasible to bring all the stakeholders in, right? Because there are markets of a scale where that can be a lot trickier. So I think that is one of the unique elements. And then there's a legacy here as well, right? While we're renaming the event, and we're conscious that we're renaming something that has existed for many, many years, and we're not doing that lightly. But there is a legacy, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I find in terms of just the atmosphere that you walk into when you visit the Toronto-based event is one of the most pleasant out of any industry event I've ever attended, and that's quite a few at this point. And whether that's a Canadian cultural thing, I'm not sure. I think it might be to some degree, because I also found, Toronto and the local population in general very, very kind of accommodating and friendly. So I think it comes a little bit from that. So, but it gives the event a little bit of a unique identity, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, selfishly speaking, I think you mentioned the intimacy earlier, and I think that's an important thing. And, for me, I look back at last year and being able to record a podcast with Sarah McCarthy and Elaine McDougall from the Responsible Gambling Council in the middle of the exhibit floor on Wednesday, and then at the end of the conference on Thursday, finding Paul Burns across the room and grabbing Paul and doing kind of a postmortem on the conference. Again, that's something that's not very easy to do at SBC Summit Lisbon, where you're dealing with tens of thousands of square feet of space and it's almost like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is that there is both a need and a justification for both versions in the industry. So I think it's important that we as organizers and the stakeholders acknowledge what each can offer you specifically, and that's where you will find the value.
That is Dennis Algreen, Senior Marketing Director for SBC. Dennis, I just want to mention that Gaming News Canada, we are a proud partner of the SBC Summit Canada, and when you go to the Substack post for this podcast, we do have information on the Toronto Summit in May, and there is a discount code for early registration. So I'd encourage our listeners to do that. Dennis, it's been far too long since we had you on the podcast. Really great to catch up with you, and certainly look forward to seeing you here in May.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks for having me, man.
That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada show presented by Bede Gaming. As always, you can find us on all of the podcast apps. You can also watch my interview with Dennis on the Gaming News Canada YouTube channel. Thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you once again to Dennis Algreen, and we will see everybody again very soon.